that cuts out at least 2 of those days that I don't need.
Right.
And so as I kept chunking through this process and said, okay, let's see if we can consolidate this back and bring this part back, I got a 13-day process into 3 hours. And we did it in a day.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. Today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Lee Wilson, remotely, of course, because of the current season. But Lee Wilson, he has an extensive career working in various roles that has brought him in contact with process documentation, process management, business process management. And even though his most recent role is the only role that has, I believe, has the official title of business process manager, he does have an extensive background in different departments within different organizations. But So Lee, thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I guess to start off with, because you have quite an interesting, I guess, journey into business process management, I might pass the ball to you to sort of introduce yourself and talk about your journey, a little bit about your journey, a brief timeline, history of where you started and where you are today.
Sure. So I guess you could say that my professional business process career sort of started around 2005 when I started in a consulting role. I was technically an EA, but I progressed into the consulting part of the business at that time. That said, I've been working since about 2000, and a lot of the roles that I started off in before I got to that sort of professional space had a lot of process stuff in it. So looking back in hindsight, with all the knowledge that I have now, I have been doing process management for quite a lot longer than that. I also ended up writing a lot of documentation back in those days as well, which drives into a lot of this discussion around process management. But back in 2005, I started with a small management consultancy, and I started learning a lot about things you would generally classify under a BA kind of role. So doing process mapping for processes, going out and meeting with clients who really didn't understand what they were trying to do or achieve, and helping them sort of understand the structure and process of how things sort of came together. From there, I've worked in, I think, 13 other jobs now since then. I bounced around quite a lot because I've done a lot of contract work, and also as a consultant, you tend to bounce around a fair bit as well. Sure. Across all of that time, I've also worked for all 3 tiers of Australian government. So I've worked in local, state and federal across various agencies and departments and different things, which has been a really great opportunity for me in terms of my career and where I've been able to go and what I've been able to do and learn. And each of those roles have primarily been in sort of the risk management space with a little bit of sort of business continuity and some things like that, which obviously have pretty reasonable ties back into this sort of process improvement space. And I guess ultimately all of that's kind of driven me through from wanting to be risk-based. More recently, I've been in the procurement space, and then this new role that I've currently just taken is in the international education sector, which is completely different from my entire background. And I'm working for a little organisation called Study Perth, who looks after marketing and branding for the city of Perth to get students to come and study here. And I'm the business process manager, although I started pretty much the day that COVID really kicked off. So I haven't done a lot of process management as such. I've been more focusing on dealing with the impact of that on the international education sector.
Yes, I can imagine. So if we talk about, if there was someone watching this interview that didn't understand what business process management really meant, or maybe they'd heard of the term or the name, but they didn't quite understand. They'd heard a number of different descriptions of it. How would you describe business process management?
It's an interesting question around that, because I find that people don't distinguish between the management part of that question and the business process part of that question, because I think they're two slightly different things. As an employee, generally business process is a pretty straightforward thing to understand. There is something that I'm trying to achieve, and there's a process to it. If I'm an accounts person, I have an accounts process. If I'm an accounts payable person, I've got the accounts payable chunk of that accounts process, those sorts of things. Whereas the management side of that is the structured governance that sits underneath all of that. So it's more about, okay, there are these processes and I have a lot of them across my organization. how are they all connecting? How are they coming back to the strategic level? How do they all relate back to what we're trying to achieve as an organization? So for me, business process management is very much that leadership of all of the processes, not just the little elements within.
And within the different organizations that you've worked with, obviously it's been, you haven't been brought into the organization to manage the business processes, but how did you find yourself in that role? Was it more of a, them filling a need as the need arose, or was it something where they could see something particularly in you that they're like, that they thought, this guy, he can do this well?
I think probably a little bit of both of those things. Because I generally am in a risk management kind of role, one of the things that quite often comes up is that I will be meeting with senior leadership to talk through some new thing that they're trying to do or some sort of element of that. And we'll talk about the process of whatever that happens to be. And they'll understand very quickly that the easiest way to do this is to map it as a process. Going in as like a BA kind of thing. You go through, you analyze what's there, do your gap analysis and those sorts of elements and bits and pieces. And then at the end of that, you end up writing something down. And something that I have excelled at quite a lot through my career is being able to clearly articulate points of things. One of the organizations I used to work for as a tech writer, they really just wanted someone to improve their supply chain processes. So I went in and I wrote down everything. They were a little bit on the archaic side for what they were doing at the time, but essentially it was writing down the process, and people quite like the way that I articulate how you write things down. So that's generally what I end up doing. So I go to any organization, doesn't matter what role I have, I always seem to end up being the one asked to write the documentation.
And when you've approached senior management about processes, documenting processes, you mentioned there that for the most part, senior management, when you say that we need to map this out, we need to document our processes, they agree that yes, that's what we should be doing. Have you, I guess, experienced any resistance to that or challenge? Like, well, what's the value in doing?
Absolutely. I think that it depends on the organization. So some organizations have to live and breathe with it because they've got a quality management system, or there's a requirement for them to have a quality management system. So I've worked in local government where they've actually had a quality management system in the local government, which I find bizarre, but well, not bizarre, I shouldn't say that. It's a weird thing to have a government entity that has its own quality management system, right, rather than necessarily requiring the external agencies who work with them to have that. Yeah. But having that in there, everything that they did needed to be processed, mapped, and documented in some way, shape, or form, which is a great way of having that. But you also have these other organizations where they're a little bit smaller, and because there's no requirement by their clients or by their stakeholders to actually have anything documented or have any rigorous process around anything, they pick and choose what they have. One organization I worked for had an HR policy, and that was pretty much the entirety of their documented processes. Everything else was, we're fine, we don't need anything else.
Right, okay.
And I couldn't get them to budge either.
Yeah, okay. So that was going to be my next question, is when you do find that resistance, how do you approach that? How do you try and articulate that to the value in documenting your processes, not just for the HR department, but for all departments and areas? Yeah,
I think that for most people, they don't really think through what documenting processes really means for people. I think when we were talking a little bit earlier about the organizations and what sort of those three things that you were mentioning about where people are sort of sitting in their process journeys, quite often it is all in people's heads. You've got the employee who has this great process that they do, it's just not documented anywhere. And I think the thing that resonates with management the most is that person, regardless of age, gender, whatever it happens to be, in terms of their demographic, where they sit in the organization, they could go at any time. And if that person is the only person who knows that process, the way that it's currently being undertaken, whether that's effectively and efficiently or whether it's absolutely atrocious, as soon as they've gone, you lose that corporate knowledge. The return on process documentation, particularly, and good sound process management is always that succession planning element. It's always about how valuable that person themselves is. Number of organizations I've worked in where everything hangs on one single individual, and we lose that one person and it's all gone. It's terrifying.
And how would you, I guess well, what I've heard before is that, as you're saying, different employees might have that fear of giving up their knowledge in the fear that they'll become redundant, because then they could take that process and then hand to anyone. How would you tackle that conversation, or that resistance from senior management, or from, if an organization wants to adopt a process management methodology or something like that, that's no guarantee that everyone's going to be on board with that. So
Yeah, I think probably two bits to your question there. But the first bit of it, definitely with the people and how they feel about their attachment to their role with associate. If you are worried about your role in an organization just because you've documented what you do, I think you've got other problems other than just that one. But I suppose by documenting your all the things you do in your role, it covers a few different things in the organization for where you are. So from an internal audit perspective, having your process documented is great. It makes it really easy for auditors to come in and say, okay, this is how it is. And if you've documented as you do it rather than documented it as it should be or as it was or all those sorts of things, and there's different aspects to that as well. I think that from my experience anyway, the management don't generally go, oh great, I've got this documented, I can now put anybody in that role. I think there's a lot more to it than that. And if you've got an organization that's doing that, like I say, it's a whole other problem to this. If you're worried about your role associated with just documenting it, I think, you need to be considering where you sit in that organization and the value that you're adding to the organization, and also what the organization value add for you is. And quite often you get asked to document these processes because it's either they're implementing a quality system or they've realized that they don't understand it. But if they've asked you to document it outside of the scope of any of those things, that's when you start having those little alarm bells go off.
Yeah. And within an organization, who should care about business process management? Obviously, senior management, then whether it's enterprise-wide or whether you're managing processes on a project-to-project basis, who should value having processes managed?
So the management of the processes, I think that anybody in senior leadership or anybody who has a staff member who reports to them with a process that they do not undertake themselves should absolutely care about it. Anything that you don't actually touch on a day-to-day basis, having some sort of process that's managed is very, very important. If you are the employee, the management of it, perhaps not necessarily as much, but definitely the documentation of your processes is useful. But again, that kind of comes back to that. How much do you do it? How often do you do it? Sometimes once it's documented, it's done and you kind of bubble your way along. There's a whole discussion around innovation around that, but essentially that your day-to-day of that. When you go up there from there to higher levels into the sort of top end of the governance structure for process, I think that's where it changes again from the day-to-day management, where you care about the fundamental, this bit does this bit does this, versus this process and this process are interconnected. And how does that help me achieve whatever I'm trying to achieve at my level? So I think everybody really ends up needing to care, just in different ways.
Yeah. And sometimes there is an objection to processes being, I guess, the small details that doesn't really impact the strategic direction of an organization. But would you consider business process management being a strategic tool?
Absolutely. I think when you're looking at how your business is structured, generally you have at the top, there's an objective or a goal or some sort of thing around that. So mission, vision, objectives and goals. And out of those objectives and goals, then you have strategies that you use to achieve those things. And then from the strategies, you have action plans or something along those lines. And then the actions that you're undertaking, that's where the process stuff sits. It sits in there and it helps you achieve the action, which helps you achieve the strategy, which helps you achieve the goal. So there's a bit of a loopy round life cycle thing for all of those things. But it absolutely plays into that, because you shouldn't be doing a process that's not ultimately in some way achieving what it is you want to do as a business.
Yeah. And if there was someone listening right now that they're in an organization where process management isn't valued and not seen as a strategic tool, what would you say to them to, I guess, equip them with, like, obviously that we're trying to form an education hub with Process Pioneers so that people can share these videos. But I guess what would you share with that person to give them the words basically to say to senior management, hey, this is a strategic tool and we need to value it as one?
So I suppose it depends on where you sit in the organization and the confidence you have to talk to certain people at certain levels. So obviously, if you work in a hierarchy of an organization where there's about 7 people between you and the CEO, you going straight to the CEO and saying, hey, we need to do this is probably not the most appropriate approach. But some organizations work like that. I've been in some organizations where you've got that 7 levels of stuff. And then the CEO says, my door's always open, come and say stuff to me, which is a lovely organization. You want all organizations to be like that. But it doesn't work like that in most of the real world. So it's about finding the right people to have the right conversations with for whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Don't go big on day one. Don't say this whole organization is stuffed until we've got this in place. Let's tear everything apart, start from scratch. You need to do this. That's not the right approach. It's more about finding somebody to connect with, to share your journey. I find that same as with the risk, trying to sell risk management in an organization, you find champions, and then those champions help you sell it to the next person along in the chain. And as much as you can stay with that journey all the way through, that's the sort of the thing you want to do. So if you're not a process manager and that you're just someone stuck in a part of the organization, so let's say that you've got a business improvement element of your business, but you don't necessarily sort of have any big seating at that top level table. It's, okay, my manager, what can I sell to them that they need to be able to push up the line? It's simple conversation stuff too. Don't start with, I need to change all these things. This is currently not documented. I can show you that there's a clear risk to the organization if this person leaves. Find those single points of failure. That's always my big one. I find that that's the easiest thing to sell to management is, you lose that one person, there's 40 years of corporate knowledge that's about to walk out the door. You cannot replace that in any way, shape or form. You should be terrified that this person is going to go, and try and sell it a little bit on the fear side of things. Fear is not always the best option, but I find that with business process, it kind of sometimes is the easiest thing to sell. If you want a positive spin, then it's about that value add as well. So it's okay. Right now, this process takes 3 months to do. I guarantee you, if we map this out, we start talking about it properly, I can reduce that down to 1 month. And all of a sudden, there's all this extra capacity in the roles that were attached to that process. Let's see what we can do with that we can now change and do better and do more with.
Mm-hmm. And that really segues nicely into my next question, which is talking about the return on investment for process management. I think senior management, that's what they want to know is what's the return? Articulate it to me in a very short space of time. Like where's the value going to come from? And for some organizations, if they embark on a process mapping modeling endeavor, that they'll want to get those quick runs on the board to see that, like, yes, this is working, and this is going to provide continued value to this organization. So talk to us a little bit more about the return on investment or the value that process documentation provides. Obviously that it's a very broad question.
I get what you're saying, and I think the quick answer to that is that the immediate tangible nature of something that's like a dollar value return, you don't always see that straight away. It's and that's a hard thing to sell to leadership. It always is. But if you can demonstrate the savings over time, if you can demonstrate some sort of way that you can identify something that will be efficient or improved in some way, that's the selling point. I'll give you a really good example from one of the first things I did in my career, which at the time I wasn't even remotely thinking about in this space, but I was asked to do an accounts receivable process. It was taking from the day that we were going to issue our invoices to the day that we actually issued the invoices. It was taking 13 days, which is, thinking about it now, a long process. This is a little bit before we kind of got to a lot of the automation and procurement processes, but let's assume that that's a reasonable amount of time back then. I looked at the process as it was happening, and I did it a couple of times exactly as it was documented, because they had a documented process for that. And it made no sense to me that certain parts of it were hung because there was a person who you had to interact with at different stages of that process. So I basically took the process apart and said, okay, if I could get that one person who comes in at these 3 separate points to do all of that part of the process right at the beginning, that cuts out at least 2 of those days that I don't need.
Right.
And so as I kept chunking through this process and said, okay, let's see if we can consolidate this back and bring this part back, I got a 13-day process into 3 hours, and we did it in a day.
Wow.
So invoices went out the day basically that we said, right, we've cut off the timesheet collection, everything's here, map the analysis out, we sit with the directors, we get this all done. It's all done in 3 hours, invoices go out. So there's the value add. So I took a process that someone chimed in and chimed out of over a period of 13 days, where we then had to wait for income to come in to that. So the immediate tangible nature of that, you're not going to see anything because I might have saved some staff time, but that's not really much of what I'm going to see. However, what you are going to see is that the invoices went out basically the day or the day after we closed off. And so instead of waiting 15 days plus whatever the amount of days on that invoice was, so 30 to 90 days, it's now 15 days shorter.
Yeah, right.
That's
right.
that value add for your leadership. So it's not always tangible, but you can make an efficiency that will then generate either a saving in staff time or a saving in process time, which then you can reallocate to other things.
Yeah. And what's the difference between, I mean, that was quite a radical change in that process that cuts it from 13 days down to 3 hours. But what's I guess it's not always going to look like that. Sometimes it is just the incremental small changes. So talk to us about, I guess, the difference between those big radical innovations in process improvement and between the small, tiny, weekly or daily tweaks that continuously improves it ever so slightly.
Yeah. So if you've got I think any process that you do should always be considered for improvement. So I find that any organization I'm working in, that whenever I'm doing something, I try and find a better way of doing it. So I currently, in my new job, I'm doing some statistical reporting, and there wasn't really a documented process for it. It was, you pull some data off of a thing, you put it into a spreadsheet, and you make it work. As I'm doing it, I'm sitting there basically copying data from one pivot table into a Word document. And I'm pulling out sort of 17 different ways of doing this data into different charts and tables. And as I was creating that, I created this Excel spreadsheet to dump it in. So it takes it out of the pivot table into another Excel spreadsheet, which then I have preset charts that populate. So all I do every time I get a new pivot table is to copy the data into one little table, which then populates all my charts. So it's not a radical change, it's not a big change, it's just a small thing. As I'm doing the process, I realize I can save my time the next time I do this by having all the stuff pre-populated and pre-ready to go.
Yeah.
So simple stuff like that. It's little things that you see along the way. You can always improve your own processes. And if anybody says in an organization that you have to do it this way, unless there's a legal or regulatory requirement that you have to do it that way, you should always be trying to find those little things that make life easier for you and make things better for the organization.
And I think for some people, it probably comes more natural to challenge the status quo and to challenge like, well, why do we do it like this? Is there a way that we can make it better? And then you'd have people that are more like yes men that will say yes, and you tell me what to do, you tell me to jump and I'll jump, and I guess not everyone's wired like that, but there does need to be those people that are challenging, like, well,
I think there's the short answer to that, which isn't really a question, but the short thing around that is that you have a lot of people who go to work to work. They don't go there to improve the work that they're doing. They go because they need paycheck and those sorts of things. If you want to get into business process management, you can't be one of those people.
Yeah.
The mindset doesn't work. You have to want to make things better. You need to have that drive to find value for your organization. You can't improve anything without that need and that drive to do that. Not saying that everybody has to have it, not that you have to do it in your organization, but I think that to really excel at it and to find the value, you've got to have that passion to say to anybody who is talking to you about anything or in what you're doing, I want this to go faster. I want this to be done a different way to achieve a different goal.
Yes, that's right. And if we're talking about business process management and versus quality management, would you say those two things go hand in hand? Would you say one sits above the other? How would you say if someone is familiar with quality management but maybe not so much business process management, how would you describe that relationship there?
So if you have no quality management system, The answer to that's very simple. Quality is exactly what the term means on its own, standalone. You have something that is valuable and is clear and is concise and is value add for an organization. If you do have a quality management system, but it's not a certified quality management system, there's a different answer again for that too, because you comply to an extent with something, so your processes need to be documented to a level of rigor, but they're not. It's a self-imposed rigor versus it being an external one. And then when you've got a certified quality management system, then there's the rigor that actually gets audited, and it has to be to the letter exact. So that's, I guess, with the system side of things. But just in terms of just general quality, process management and quality, they are not completely interchangeable. I think that they have that real connection, that you need to have a process that is well documented and clear, and I think that's the simplest version of quality.
No, that's good. And for an organisation that they have a quality management is a priority for them and it is valued, but it's they haven't, I guess, embarked into the world of business process management. What are the first steps that they should be taking, going from that quality management mindset into BPM?
So if you've got a quality, anything quality management space, or if it's just a priority for your organization, then the first step, I think, is to work out what that needs to look like for you. So if your intention is purely just to say, okay, well, I need a set of policies and a few instructions for how some things go, so be it. I mean, you don't have to go to the nth degree. It's what's going to sit well in your organization. So I've worked for a company where they had 8 employees, and we had a full-blown certified quality management system to the top standard of what it needed to be. And we had about maybe 30 or 40 quality processes that had everything fall out of them. So there's probably about 200 odd documents that were being documented as processes throughout the organization for 8 people, which is crazy to me, but it added value for their clients and those sorts of things. And it's a great selling point that, we got this amazing system and it all kind of works and how that. But you don't have to have all of that. And even as a basic level of getting certified for quality management systems, you'd be surprised at how little documentation you actually need for that.
Right.
So from a process management perspective, it's document what you find adds value and what is going to work for your organization. So if you don't need to have documented something, particularly small organizations like that one, when someone comes in and audits you, if every person in that organization can tell you how the process goes without it being documented, and it's all the same every time the answer gets given, you pass your audit. So documenting a process and having a process are two separate things. And from a quality perspective, you need the documentation. From a process perspective and process management perspective, you don't always have to have it documented. You can just have a process that just works. If people understand it, it's clear. And I think the value add with the process documentation, I think, though, is that you can then clearly say, oh, everybody knows what this is and I can see it and I can then start tearing it apart. Versus when you've got all those people who don't have it documented for them, as soon as you start tearing it apart, it starts to fall apart.
Now obviously they've got, in documenting your processes, as you're talking about, you can go down to multiple levels of process documentation. Some organizations just have that sort of enterprise architecture level. Some organizations will go down to the second or the third layer. Some will go down to level 7, level 8, get into work procedures and things like that. I mean, I feel like you kind of answered it a little bit in that one, but what if an organization were trying to figure out, well, how great a detail do we go with our process documentation? Do we go down to the seventh level because it's working really good for that organization over there? What would you encourage them to do in finding out what works for them?
If you haven't got anybody who can give you advice on that internally, get somebody to come and give you that advice. You want to know what your business is trying to achieve. And if your senior leadership, who are the ones who are generally driving this discussion, don't understand enough about it, they really need someone who has that advice. Now, quite often you're going to have somebody in your organization who can give you that advice, or at least have some pretty good idea about it, where they've worked somewhere else and they understand how they've had it. But it's not about this works in this other organization, because there is absolutely zero one-size-fits-all to process management. There just is not. No organization is the same, and nobody can replicate a process, because people. It changes between that. And that comes back to that thing I was saying before about the drive and the passion of the person. If you've got someone who's a dinosaur, who's in a role, who just comes in every day and does exactly the same thing day in, day out, and will not change and will not budge, that's very different to having someone sitting there who goes, oh, I'm new, I'm fresh-faced, I want to make a difference in this organization, I want to change things. So it's, there's a journey, but you need to be very clear that this is what our organization is trying to achieve. And if the leadership isn't driving that sort of top down, you're going to have a lot of trouble working with in any form of process management.
Yeah. Now talking about process governance, so having some sort of governance over the process documentation, some people would say that's control, some people would say it creates liberty. Where do you sit, and how would you tackle that?
I think that the most important part about having governance around anything is that it creates a structure for reporting back on what you're trying to achieve. So if I've got a project that I'm undertaking and there's a whole lot of processes associated with my project, the governance dictates how much of that anybody cares about at any given time. So from that perspective, it's very much a control thing. I report to somebody reports to somebody else, ultimately somebody makes a decision, and then I act on that decision. Governance, control, ideal. From a liberty kind of thing, I find that it depends on where the process sits. So if you're not doing a project, so if you're just doing day-to-day business stuff, having a documented process or having a process ability to improve a process, it is liberty, it's freedom. I get told I need to create this stat report, do it however you want, so long as I get the end result. I change the process as I see fit. It's complete freedom, despite the fact that the governance part of that is at the top that says, I want the outcome. There's freedom of process for me to decide how I deliver that outcome. So I generally lean towards answering your question is I love control in the governance space, but I think that the liberty of process improvement needs to be there for some things. It just depends on the context of what we're talking about.
Right. And obviously with some organisations and their process management, they I guess they might see governance as slowing things down or having all the checks in place. It's putting the brakes on what the work that we need to get done. How would you speak into that?
So a lot of it, and this is not just process, whenever you talk about governance, everyone does that. It's the red tape part of the process. It's the red tape scary stuff that really does. It's a roadblock. It stops everything from going ahead. I'll give you a really good example of why it's absolutely vital and important that you get governance right. I had a project which had a mass amount of stakeholder engagement associated with it, and it had 2 executive level sponsors who didn't communicate whatsoever, and there was no documented requirement for this governance to exist. So one of those directors was associated with that stakeholder chunk, and the other one was associated with the delivery of the project chunk. And because those 2 people weren't communicating in any way, shape or form, they had different structures of hierarchy that led up to them. And so you had this lack of clarity about who was actually in charge. So one director would make one decision, one director would make another decision, and those 2 decisions often clashed. So not having the clarity of governance and the clarity of structure around that really caused no end of problems.
Right.
And I get that having extra meetings to put people in the same space and have those communications and have that control over things would have felt to those 2 directors and then all the staff that sat under them as all this extra work that they had to go through because I had to now jump through 2 hoops to get through this delivery. We'll ignore the fact that the easiest solution to that would have been to take away one of those 2 sponsors of the project. But to actually have all of that communication is just so vital to the project, because the whole thing was just a shambles because of the fact that the governance wasn't working at the level it needed to. And it's simply solved by just bringing people together and having those communications and having those discussions. So it is always going to feel a little bit like extra work, and sometimes, sure, it is, but there's a reason for it. It drives everything together. It gives you that quality outcome. And if you really want something to achieve, good governance is the only way you're going to get there.
Yeah, okay. And let's talk about the difference between process on a project-to-project level and enterprise-wide. We touched on it, but in a different way earlier in the conversation. But if there is some organisations, they look at processes from a very we just need to manage our processes to get this specific project complete, and so they'll do a very thorough job for that individual project. Other organizations will take more of an enterprise-wide approach, business as usual. What are we doing day to day, and how can we improve the day-to-day operations? Talk to us about the difference between those two and why, I guess, the importance of doing both.
Yeah. So on a project space, you've got a clear goal and a clear target, and you can generally get away with a lot more in terms of radical, rapid change. Day to day in organizations, you've got 10 times or more the stakeholders to worry about, and change management is a very different discussion, a very different journey. So they're really completely different beasts. It's such a big thing to do a change in an organization. Even if you're doing small increments, you're affecting a lot of people organization wide. I was a procurement leader in an organization. I wanted to change the whole thing from where it was to where it needed to be. And I couldn't just on day one say, well, everything goes out the window. Let's start from my grand plan. So it needed to be that incremental change. And I had to engage a lot of people along that journey. Whereas when you're sitting in a project and the project starts here and finishes here, the processes that you're managing sit in that space, and you're only affecting a small number of people. So I think that's the difference between the two things. Is that your change management piece is so different between the parts.
Yeah. And obviously for you have quite an interesting journey where you've ended up in the process space, and as a business process manager, having not had, I guess, formal qualification or done that study, and you've kind of found your way in various roles that keep bringing you into contact with process documentation, process management. But for someone, and in talking with you, it sounds like it's something that you pick up quite quickly. Maybe it's your analytical brain, but it's something that you can you understand quite quickly. But for someone that maybe they're within an organization and they know that process management is improvement, or maybe there's someone from senior management listening right now, where do you, I guess to start with, where did your learning come from? Like, obviously it was was it all trial and error? Were you listening to podcasts?
To be honest, I've done very little professional development in this space. It's really all been on the job. The primary place I guess I've learned stuff is writing, like just general writing. So I started out as professional career, not other stuff, retail and those sorts of things, but started out my professional career as an EA. So I was working for company directors. I was writing letters and things like that on their behalf and working on the structure of how I wrote. And as that sort of transitioned into consulting a little bit, I found that the structure of how I worded things and how I was able to make clarity around points was what really kind of helped me on that journey towards where I ended up. So for anybody who doesn't do this stuff on a daily basis or wants to start on the journey, or you want to start an employee on this journey, a good process manager is somebody who can take something and write it down in a way that is understandable by any audience. This is one of those weird skill sets that sure that you can do some courses on it, but I think that the best value is for those people who, as they go on this journey through their careers, whatever they're doing, it doesn't matter if they're in this space or not, is someone who can then take what they've seen and then apply that in a different way the next time around so that it sees that improvement. So you're not necessarily learning how to be a process manager, you're learning how to be an innovator, how to be someone who can see something and problem solve it. And it's the little stuff. And start with your own world. Start with what you do on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't have to be massive. It can be really contained into those small little things, like my stat stuff. It's that small little journey. And to learn more about it and to get yourself started on how to go through those things, if you can do a half-day course or something like that, those are great ways of kind of getting that quick, starting you thinking about it stuff, and listening to these sorts of podcasts. It's just a great way for you to get that introduction to what people are talking about, what they're thinking about.
Yeah, and I'd imagine there's obviously a huge difference in theory, listening to something, reading something, and putting it into practice, and I guess feeling the pain of when you do make a mistake or when something doesn't play out as you thought it would, and then making those changes.
Absolutely, and also with having a different person in every organization. I think I was saying before, no organization is the same. So you can listen to me talking about this and my journey and what I've been doing, and you then try and apply some of the things that I've talked about, and you go, oh, that's definitely not going to work for me. Like my boss isn't going to be like that. They're not going to respond to that. Quite often you're going to have someone who's very much like me, who has this real gung-ho, I want to change everything kind of approach. And then you've got the person who sits directly above that, who is the dinosaur, who doesn't want to change. So they're just going to sit there and they go, no, to everything that you say.
Yeah.
Organizations are different. So, and then it stops being about, and this is where I like to link my wonderful experience in the risk management space. If you are in a role that people don't understand, or they don't like, or they don't get, it stops being about being able to do it. Risk management, I can teach someone how to do risk management in 5 seconds. It's making a decision. I can teach someone how to do business process management in 5 seconds, because the actual key tools to doing it are like, this big. The people skills you need and the ability to negotiate and influence, that's the stuff you just can't teach in a half-day course. It's something that you will learn over time, and that's the journey you want to take. It's being able to have a communication with somebody that isn't influencing communication.
That's amazing. Well, Lee Wilson, it's been an absolute privilege to be able to sit with you today. Obviously, the goal of this whole podcast series is to talk with different people like yourself. And as you mentioned in your last answer there, talking about the diverse range of people in a diverse number of organizations that think differently, that do things differently. And so I think that's where the value from talking to the individuals that are actually on the ground doing the work, that's where the real value is going to come from as we build this sort of multifaceted sort of education collaboration hub. So Lee, I thank you so much for joining with me today, and I'm excited to release this interview, and look forward to hearing everyone's feedback and response when it's released.
Thanks for having me.